The war between humans and Illyrians had ended only 2 months ago. After years of fighting, both sides were tired. They wanted peace, but peace was not easy when both races had lost so much. Now, humans and Illyrians were trying to trust each other, even though fear still lived in their hearts. Commander Jack Reeves sat in his small room on the human base, polishing his old metal. He had fought in many battles. His strong hands, full of scars, showed the life of the soldier. Jack liked to be alone. He didn't enjoy the company of others, especially now that he had been sent to this faraway planet to keep the peace. A knock on the door broke the silence. Jack sighed and stood up. "Come in," he said, not looking up. The door opened, and 2 guards entered. Between them stood a small, thin girl. Her skin was pale blue, and her eyes were large, glowing softly like moons. She looked around the room with fear, her hands shaking. "Commander Reeve," said one of the guards, "this is Ciala, a gift from the Illyrian Council as part of the peace agreement. She belongs to you now." Jack raised an eyebrow. "A gift? What am I supposed to do with her? I'm a soldier, not—" He stopped himself, unsure what words to use. "It's an honor, sir," the guard said quickly. "She will serve you as you wish. The Illyrians hope this will make peace stronger." Jack looked at Ciala. She stood quietly, her eyes wide and frightened. Jack could see her breathing fast, like a small animal ready to run. "Fine," he said at last, waving his hand. "Leave her here." The guards nodded and left, closing the door behind them. Jack sat down on his chair, rubbing his face. "What a mess," he muttered. Ciala stayed near the door, not moving. She thought if she stayed still, maybe the human wouldn't hurt her. Jack looked at her. "You don't have to stand like that. Sit down, or do whatever you want." Ciala didn't move. Jack sighed. He stood up and went to the small kitchen area. He poured water into a cup and placed it on the table. "You thirsty?" he asked. Still, Ciala didn't answer. Jack frowned. "Do you understand me?" Slowly, Ciala nodded. Jack walked back to his chair and sat down. He watched her for a moment, trying to understand why anyone would send him an Illyrian girl as a gift. Meanwhile, Ciala was thinking hard. She had heard many terrible things about humans. They were strong, loud, and dangerous. Her people said humans ate Illyrians when they were angry. Looking at Jack, with his rough face and cold eyes, she believed it. Ciala's stomach turned. She thought, "He is waiting to eat me. That's why they gave me to him." Jack didn't know what was going on in her mind. He only knew that she looked like she might faint at any moment. "Look," he said, trying to sound softer. "I don't know why you're here, but I'm not going to hurt you, all right? I don't want a servant, and I definitely don't want whatever this is supposed to be." Ciala looked up at him quickly, her eyes full of fear. Jack sighed again. He felt tired. Why did they think this would bring peace? Giving people as gifts. It felt wrong. He stood up and opened a small cabinet. Inside were some food packs. He took one out, opened it, and placed it on the table with a fork. "Here," he said. "Eat something." Ciala stared at the food but didn't move. Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Suit yourself." He walked to the window and looked out at the strange sky of the alien world. 2 suns were setting, painting the sky orange and purple. Behind him, Ciala slowly moved to the table. She picked up the fork with shaking hands and sniffed the food carefully, as if checking for poison. Jack turned and saw her. He gave a small smile, though he knew she didn't trust him yet. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Ciala didn't answer, but she took a small bite. It tasted strange, but not bad. She kept her eyes on Jack the whole time, ready to run if he got close. Jack sat back down, watching her eat. "Guess we'll have to figure this out, huh?" he said, half to himself. Ciala didn't understand all his words, but she knew one thing for sure. The human hadn't eaten her. Not yet. As night fell, Jack lay back in his chair and closed his eyes, while Ciala curled up in a corner, still scared, but a little less sure about what humans really were. The room was quiet, but both of them knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Jack woke up to find Ciala sitting near the corner of his room, wide awake and staring out the small window. She hadn't moved much overnight, still sitting in the same place she had curled up in last night. Her eyes looked tired, but there was a kind of strength in them that Jack hadn't seen before. Jack rubbed his eyes, stretching his arms. "Good morning," he said, trying to sound friendly. Ciala turned her head to look at him but didn't say anything. She stayed silent, her eyes filled with worry. Jack noticed that she seemed to flinch slightly every time he moved. "Look," Jack began, trying again. "I'm not going to hurt you. I don't know why you think I might, but that's not who I am." Ciala didn't respond. She just kept staring at him, her hands trembling slightly. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know why I'm doing this," he muttered. "This is crazy." He glanced at her. "Why would they send you to me? I don't know how to deal with this." He walked to the small kitchen area to get some food, hoping to break the silence. "Food?" Jack asked, holding out a packet of breakfast bars. Ciala's eyes widened at the sight of the food, but she didn't reach for it. Her stomach growled softly, but she didn't move. She was too afraid. Jack watched her, waiting for a sign. "Please," he said, trying his best to sound calm. "It's just food. You don't have to be scared of me." Ciala's eyes darted to the bar in his hand, but she didn't take it. Instead, she shook her head quickly, as though refusing to trust him. Jack frowned, unsure of what to do. He had no idea what she was thinking. Was she afraid of me? He wondered. He didn't know much about the Illyrians, but he had heard rumors of their gentle nature. Perhaps Ciala had been raised in a world that taught her to fear humans. After a long pause, Jack decided to sit at the table, leaving the food there, but not pressing it on her. "You don't have to eat if you don't want to," Jack said softly. "But if you're hungry, it's there." Ciala slowly looked down at the food, her eyes still full of uncertainty. She seemed to be thinking. Jack, watching her, couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. It was clear that Ciala didn't trust him at all. But what could he do to change that? As the day went on, Jack tried to make small talk. He told Ciala stories about Earth, about his childhood, and the places he had visited during his military service. But Ciala didn't speak a word. She simply watched him, her large eyes filled with suspicion. Jack grew frustrated. "You've got to talk to me, you know. I can't just sit here, not knowing what you're thinking." Ciala's eyes flashed with fear as she glanced at him. She didn't want to make any sound. In her mind, speaking to him might be a mistake. But her curiosity was growing. What was this human like? Was he really different from what she had been told? Hours passed, and Jack eventually gave up trying to talk. Instead, he sat at his desk, sorting through papers and equipment. He glanced over at Ciala, who had started to move a little more, stretching her legs and even standing up to walk around the room. Jack didn't stop her. He let her explore, thinking she might feel less trapped. He went back to his work, trying to ignore the quiet tension in the room. But even though she moved more freely, Ciala's mind was still filled with fear. Every sound made her jump. She didn't know what would happen next. She had been raised to believe that humans were unpredictable and dangerous. It didn't help that everything about Jack's behavior seemed so different from what she expected. As the day turned into evening, Ciala found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the alien sky. It was a strange sight. The two suns had set, and the stars were beginning to shine. The sky was a deep purple, and strange lights flickered in the distance. For a moment, she felt at peace, but then the fear returned. Would this human eat her tonight? Would she be alone again? Jack noticed her staring out the window. He was about to speak when he saw her shoulders drop in exhaustion. She looked so fragile, like she might collapse at any moment. He stood up and walked over to her. "You okay?" he asked gently. Sayala's eyes flicked to him quickly. She wasn't used to kindness. In her world, kindness was a rare thing. Humans had always been enemies to her kind, but Jack, he was different. Was it possible? Could he really be different? "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack repeated, his voice quieter now. "You're safe here. I don't want anything from you except, well, I don't know. Maybe we can figure this out together." Ciala stared at him for a long moment, her thoughts racing. There was something about him that didn't seem dangerous. Maybe he wasn't like the others. Maybe humans weren't all the same. Still, she couldn't let her guard down completely. She had to be careful. After a long silence, Ciala slowly stood up and walked to the table. She picked up the food pack Jack had left earlier and, after another long pause, took a small bite. Jack watched her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maybe this was progress, even if it was slow. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. There were still so many things they didn't understand about each other. The war might have ended, but trust had not yet been built. And peace, true peace, would take more than just kind words. But for now, Jack was willing to wait. He could see a change in her, a small spark of trust. And that was a start. The days seemed to blend together. Time passed slowly in Jack's small quarters, and every moment felt like a new challenge. Despite the awkward silence between them, things were changing. Slowly, Jack had noticed a few things about Ciala. Her eyes weren't as wide with fear anymore, and her steps were less hesitant. But still, she didn't speak much. She watched him carefully, like a bird ready to fly at any sign of danger. Jack tried to make things easier. He kept talking to her, telling her stories about Earth and his life before the war. But Ciala only listened, never speaking unless absolutely necessary. It seemed like she was afraid to say the wrong thing, like her words might make everything worse. One afternoon, Jack decided to do something different. He wanted to see if Ciala would open up even just a little. He had been thinking about how much he missed Earth, missed the simple things, the smell of fresh air, the sound of birds, the warmth of sunlight. He had nothing to lose. He stood up from his chair, glancing over at Ciala. "You ever seen a tree?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Ciala blinked, confused by the question. "A tree," she repeated. "Yeah," Jack said with a small smile. "A tree. They're these big plants, with leaves that change color in the fall. You know, they're like the heart of the earth in a way." Ciala tilted her head. She was still uncertain but curious. "Where can I see one?" Jack's smile grew wider. He didn't know if she was joking or serious, but it didn't matter. "Well, not here. But there are pictures," he said, walking over to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a photo album. "This is a picture of one from Earth. I'll show you." Ciala took the album carefully, her fingers grazing over the edges of the pages. She flipped through the album slowly, her eyes growing wider with each turn. "They're so big," she whispered, awe in her voice. Jack watched her reaction with interest. He had never seen anyone look at a tree like that before. "Yeah, they can get huge. Some are hundreds of years old. And in the fall, the leaves turn all kinds of colors. Red, orange, yellow." Ciala stopped on a page with a picture of a forest covered in golden leaves. She stared at it for a long time. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. Jack nodded, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. "Yeah, it is. Maybe one day you can see it in person." Ciala didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told Jack that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to imagine that possibility. She closed the album gently and handed it back to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack smiled. "You're welcome." That evening, after a quiet dinner, Ciala surprised Jack by sitting next to him on the couch. She had never sat close to him before, and Jack wasn't sure what had changed. Maybe it was the photo album, Or maybe it was the trust she was slowly starting to build. "Do you miss your home?" Ciela asked, her voice still soft but clear. Jack looked at her, surprised that she had spoken first. He paused, thinking about the question. "Yeah, I miss Earth sometimes. I miss the quiet places, like the forests. But mostly, I miss my family, the people I used to know." Ciela looked down at her hands. She seemed to understand the feeling, even though she hadn't said much about her own home. "I miss my people," she said quietly. Jack could feel the sadness in her words, and for the first time, he realized how much pain she must have carried with her. She wasn't just a gift from the Illyrians. She was a person, just like him, with a life she had left behind. He nodded, trying to find the right words. "I get that. It's hard to be away from home. But hey, maybe one day, we'll both find a way to go back. Maybe we'll figure this whole thing out." Ciela nodded, but she didn't say anything more. She leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. Jack stayed silent too, unsure of what to say next. It was the first time in a while that they were both quiet, not because of fear, but because they were thinking. The next day, Jack decided to try something new. He wanted to show Ciela that humans didn't only fight. They could also be creative. He took out a small paint set he had left from when he used to work in training. "You ever painted before?" he asked her. Ciela looked at the paint set curiously but shook her head. "No, I've never painted." "Well, you're about to learn," Jack said with a smile. He set up a canvas on the table and dipped a brush into the paint. "It's fun. Trust me." Ciela hesitated, then slowly reached out to take the brush. She didn't speak, but her eyes seemed a little less guarded. She started to paint, her strokes slow and unsure at first. But soon, she was moving the brush with more confidence, creating swirling patterns of color. Jack watched in quiet amazement as she worked. He couldn't believe how quickly she seemed to pick up on it, how her fingers moved with a kind of natural grace. As she finished, she stepped back and looked at her work. It was a strange mix of colors, a swirl of blue and purple, with hints of green and gold. It didn't look like anything Jack had ever seen before, but somehow it felt like it captured something he couldn't put into words. "That's really good," Jack said. Ciela smiled faintly, but it was the first real smile he had seen from her. "I've never done that before," she said, almost surprised. Jack chuckled. "I guess you're a natural." For a moment, it felt like things were finally changing between them. They weren't just soldier and alien anymore. They were two people, sharing something small but important, a connection. Jack didn't know what would happen next, but he had a feeling that, no matter how hard things got, they would find a way to make it work, together. The days continued to pass in quiet rhythms. Jack's routine remained mostly unchanged, but there was something different now. Every morning, Ciela would greet him with a small nod, and sometimes she even smiled. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that she was beginning to trust him, just a little more. Jack had started to enjoy these small moments. He had always been a soldier, focused on missions and orders, but now, with Ciela's presence in his life, there was a new sense of calm. He had never thought he'd find comfort in the company of an alien, but here they were, living together, learning to understand each other. One afternoon, Jack decided to take Ciela outside. He hadn't shown her much of the base yet, and he thought it might be a good idea to get some fresh air. He knew it would be good for both of them. Ciela had been in the small room for days now, and Jack hadn't left his quarters much either. Maybe seeing the outside world would change things. "You ready?" Jack asked, looking over at her. Ciela was sitting by the window, her eyes following the movement of the clouds in the sky. She looked more peaceful than usual. Ciela nodded, standing up slowly. She was hesitant, but she followed Jack out the door. As they walked down the hall, she seemed curious but cautious, her eyes wide as she took in everything around her. She had been to many different places in her life, but this human base was unlike anything she had ever seen. They reached the outer doors of the base, where the sunlight was warm against their skin. The air was fresh, with a hint of something unfamiliar, something like the sweet smell of flowers in bloom. Siala's eyes fluttered as she breathed it in, almost like she couldn't believe the sensation. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Jack said with a smile. Siala didn't answer right away. She just took another deep breath, her face softening. "Yes," she finally said. "It feels different. Peaceful." Jack nodded, happy to see her relaxing. He motioned to the wide field in front of them. "That's the training area. Not much happening right now, since the war's over, but we use it for exercises and drills. I don't usually come out here much, but I thought you might like to see something different." Siala walked forward, her feet brushing over the grass. She seemed fascinated by how soft it was beneath her, bending down to touch it gently. Jack watched her for a moment, unsure of what to say. He was so used to talking about missions, tactics, and war. But now, standing here with Siala, all of that felt far away. She straightened up after a moment and looked at him. "This is strange. I have never felt grass before." Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really? You've never seen grass?" Siala shook her head slowly. "No, where I come from, we do not have grass. Our land is different. It is rocky, with hard surfaces. Nothing soft like this." Jack took a step closer. "It's nice, isn't it? Something so simple can feel so different." Siala nodded, her eyes still wide with wonder. "Yes, it feels alive, like it's a part of something bigger." Jack smiled softly. "Yeah, you know, that's how I feel about Earth. It's full of little things like this, things you don't notice until you really stop and look." Siala didn't answer, but her expression seemed to soften even more. She bent down again and touched the grass, her fingers lingering in the blades as if she were savoring the moment. Jack let her enjoy the quiet, feeling a sense of calm settle over him as well. This was a different kind of peace. No wars, no battles, just the two of them standing in the sun, connected by the simplest of things. After a while, Jack spoke again. "I think we should do this more often. Just get out of the room and see the world. I know you're still adjusting, but I think it'll help. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to like it here." Siala stood up, brushing her hands off and looking at him. "I don't know if I can like it here," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can ever forget what has happened." Jack's face became serious. "I get that. Believe me, I get it. But we can't live in the past forever. We got to move forward. And maybe that means making new memories here, together." Siala didn't respond, but there was a shift in her eyes. It was like she was beginning to understand what he meant. She looked down at the grass one last time, as if trying to imagine a future where she didn't carry the weight of war on her shoulders. After a long pause, Siala spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "I'll try. I'll try to understand." Jack smiled. "That's all I can ask for. Just try." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the base, Jack explaining different parts of it while Siala listened, asking questions here and there. It was a small step, but it felt like a big one. For the first time, Siala wasn't just a stranger to him. She was someone he could talk to, someone who might one day understand the life he had left behind on Earth. As they walked back to the building, Siala paused and looked up at Jack. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for showing me this." Jack looked down at her and nodded. "You're welcome. Anytime." They returned to the room, but this time, it felt different. There was no tension in the air, no awkward silence. It was like they had shared something important, something real. Jack felt a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work. Maybe they could both heal in their own time. The days continued to move forward, each one a little more relaxed than the last. Siala was no longer as afraid of Jack as she had been when she first arrived. She didn't watch him so closely anymore, waiting for him to make a wrong move. Instead, she was starting to look at him as a person, someone who was different from the other humans she had known. Jack, for his part, was beginning to understand Ciela as well. He saw how careful she was, how much thought she put into every action, every word. It wasn't easy for her to trust anyone, not after everything she had been through. But Jack was learning how to be patient. He wasn't in a rush. They had all the time in the world. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jack and Ciela sat outside in the small garden area near the base. The air was cooler now, and the sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink. It was a peaceful evening, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he could breathe. Ciela was sitting beside him, her legs tucked underneath her as she watched the sunset. She didn't speak, but Jack could tell she was deep in thought. He had learned by now that when she was quiet, she was thinking about something important. "Do you miss home?" Jack asked after a while. He had asked her this question before, but every time he asked, she gave a different answer. Sometimes she said she missed her people. Sometimes she said she didn't know what to miss anymore. Ciela didn't answer right away. She was looking at the horizon, her eyes reflecting the soft colors of the setting sun. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and thoughtful. "Yes," she said, her words slow. "I miss the feeling of my people around me. I miss the sound of our voices in the night. But I also miss the silence. The kind of silence where you know you are alone, but not lonely. I miss that." Jack listened carefully, trying to understand. He knew what she meant, in a way. There were times when he missed the peace of being alone, the quiet moments before everything changed. He nodded, looking at the sunset with her. "I get that," he said. "Sometimes silence feels like the safest thing, like nothing can hurt you when everything is still." Ciela turned her head toward him, her eyes softening. "You understand?" asked, surprised. Jack smiled gently. "Yeah, I do. There's something about being alone, but not really being lonely. That's comforting." For a long moment, they sat in silence, both of them watching the sky change. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like they were both sharing something without needing to speak. Jack could feel the distance between them shrinking, bit by bit. After the sun had fully set, the stars began to appear in the sky. Ciela's eyes brightened as she looked up, the lights twinkling in her gaze. "What are those?" she asked, pointing toward the stars. Jack looked up and smiled. "Those are stars. They're part of every night sky on Earth. They've been there for thousands of years." Ciela stared at the stars, her face a mix of wonder and sadness. "I have seen stars before," she said quietly, "but not like this. Not so close." "Yeah," Jack agreed, his voice softer now. "There's something about the stars that makes you feel small, but in a good way. Like you realize how big the universe is, but it doesn't make you feel lost. It makes you feel like you're a part of something bigger." Ciela nodded slowly. "I like that," she said, her voice almost a whisper. They sat there for a while longer, just watching the sky. For the first time, it felt like they were sharing something beyond the words. They didn't need to explain everything. The stars, the silence, the calm between them, it spoke for itself. Later that night, as they returned to Jack's quarters, Ciela seemed different. There was something lighter about her, like she had found a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. Jack could sense the change in her, and it made him feel hopeful. Maybe they were both starting to heal in their own way. That night, as they sat at the table, Jack noticed Ciela's gaze drift to the small paint set they had used a few days earlier. He had left it out on the table, hoping she might use it again. She had been quiet since their talk outside, and Jack could tell she was still thinking about their conversation. "You want to paint?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. Ciela hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I think I would like that." She picked up the brush, dipping it into the paint carefully. Her strokes were slow and deliberate at first, But as she worked, her confidence grew. Jack watched her, amazed at how quickly she seemed to pour her thoughts onto the canvas. "Can I see?" Jack asked, leaning in as she finished. Scylla stepped back, her eyes bright with a mix of pride and uncertainty. The painting was a swirl of colors, blue, green, and purple, with hints of gold and silver. It wasn't a landscape or a figure, but it felt like a reflection of her emotions. It felt alive, like it had its own heartbeat. "That's beautiful," Jack said, his voice filled with awe. Scylla looked at the painting and smiled softly. "It is how I feel. I think it is how I am." Jack nodded. He understood what she meant. The painting wasn't just a picture, it was a part of her, a way to express everything she couldn't say in words. "Thank you for sharing that with me," Jack said quietly. Scylla looked at him, and for the first time, she seemed at peace. "Thank you for listening. It wasn't much, just a small moment in time, but it was enough." They weren't just soldier and alien anymore. They were two people, learning to understand each other, one quiet moment at a time. The days grew warmer, and the quiet life inside the base became more familiar. Jack's routine had changed, but not in a way that bothered him. There was something about having Scylla around that made everything feel a little less lonely. She was no longer just a reminder of the past, but someone who was becoming a part of his present. Scylla was beginning to open up more as well. She spent her time with Jack, helping him with small tasks or simply talking to him. Her voice was still soft, but the words she shared were becoming more meaningful. She had stories of her own, things about her people and her home that she had kept hidden for so long. One evening, after a long day of quiet conversation and painting, Jack noticed a shift in Scylla. She wasn't just sitting silently, waiting for something to happen. She was more present, more engaged, and Jack could see that she was starting to trust him in a way she hadn't before. "Are you tired?" Jack asked, glancing at Scylla as she leaned over the table, her brush in hand. Scylla paused, her eyes flickering over to him. "A little," she said, but her voice wasn't as tired as it had been in the past. It sounded more thoughtful, like she was reflecting on something. Jack smiled. "We can take a break if you want." Scylla shook her head. "No, I want to finish this," she said softly, a hint of determination in her voice. Jack leaned back in his chair, watching her work. He had never been one for painting, but watching Scylla create something with her hands felt important. It was as if she was finding a way to speak through the brushstrokes, a language that didn't need words. He realized then that Scylla had come so far from the fearful, uncertain being she had been when she first arrived. She was starting to let herself be part of this world, a world she had once feared, and it made Jack feel a sense of pride. Not just for her, but for both of them. They were finding their way in this strange new life, one small step at a time. "You're good at this," Jack said, breaking the silence. "You know that, right?" Scylla glanced at him, her face slightly flushed. I never thought I could be. It feels right, you know. Like I'm letting something out." Jack nodded. He understood what she meant. It wasn't just about making art. It was about finding a way to express herself, a way to show the parts of herself that she couldn't say with words. He respected that. He respected her for it. "You've come a long way," Jack said quietly. "When I first met you, you didn't even want to talk to me. Now, you're painting, you're sharing your stories. I'm proud of you, Scylla." Scylla's eyes softened at his words. She had never heard a human say something like that to her before. It wasn't just praise. It was genuine. It made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Accepted. I'm not sure if I deserve your pride," she said softly, but there was no sadness in her voice. Just a quiet uncertainty. "You do," Jack said firmly, leaning forward. "You really do." There was a long pause as Scylla absorbed his words. She looked down at the painting she had been working on, the brush now resting in her hand. The canvas was filled with swirling colors, bright and bold, yet soft and delicate at the same time. It was a beautiful reflection of her journey, and Jack could see that it meant something important to her. "I didn't think I could feel this way," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think I could trust anyone again. Not after everything that happened." Jack's heart ached for her. He knew what she meant. He had seen the pain in her eyes when she first arrived. He had seen how closed off she was, how much she was hurting. But he also saw something else now. Something that told him she wasn't lost anymore. She was starting to find herself again. "You've been through a lot," Jack said gently. "More than anyone should have to. But you're stronger than you think. You're not alone anymore, Shiala." Shiala's eyes met his, and for the first time, she didn't look away. There was something different in her gaze, something that wasn't just fear or caution. It was understanding, and maybe even a little bit of hope. Maybe I'm starting to believe that," she said slowly. Jack smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. It wasn't a big change, not yet, but it was a start. It was a moment where everything felt just a little more possible, a moment where they both took a step toward something better. As the evening wore on, the quiet conversation continued, flowing naturally between them. They spoke about everything and nothing, sharing small details about their lives that they hadn't revealed before. For the first time, Jack felt like he was seeing the real Shiala, the person beneath the pain and the walls she had built around herself. Later that night, after they had finished painting, Shiala turned to Jack with a thoughtful look on her face. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" she asked. Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if the war had never happened. If we weren't here, in this place, talking to each other like this. Do you think we could have met another way, under different circumstances?" Jack thought for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm glad we did meet, even if it wasn't the way either of us expected." Shiala's eyes softened. "Yes, me too." For a brief moment, they both sat in silence, just being in each other's company. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt like they had reached an understanding. The past would always be with them, but it didn't have to define them. They were both capable of moving forward, if only they gave themselves the chance. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something worth looking forward to. The days blurred into one another as Jack and Shiala continued their quiet life at the base. The once strange silence between them had now become a comfortable silence, filled with moments of understanding and shared experiences. Each day, they took small steps forward, learning from one another, discovering new parts of themselves they hadn't known existed. Shiala's trust in Jack had deepened. She no longer watched him with suspicion or uncertainty. She now saw him as a friend, someone who cared, someone she could rely on. And Jack, in turn, had learned to see Shiala not just as an alien from another world, but as a person with hopes, dreams, and a past she carried with her. Her story was painful, but Jack had come to understand that the past didn't define her. It was her actions, her courage, that spoke the loudest. One afternoon, as they sat together on the small porch outside the base, Shiala turned to Jack, a thoughtful expression on her face. The warm sunlight bathed them both in a soft golden glow, and the peaceful surroundings felt like a perfect backdrop to their growing friendship. "Jack," she began, her voice soft but clear, "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About the past. About what's next." Jack looked over at her, his eyes full of curiosity. He had noticed that Shiala seemed more reflective than usual, and he knew that something important was on her mind. "What's going on, Shiala?" he asked gently. "You've been quieter than usual lately." Shiala sighed, a slight frown tugging at her lips. "I think I'm finally starting to understand something. Something important." Jack waited for her to continue. It wasn't unusual for Shiala to take her time with words. When she spoke, she always chose her words carefully, as though she was trying to say just the right thing. I've been running away from my past, she said after a moment, her eyes not meeting his. I've been so focused on the pain, on what was lost, that I never really gave myself a chance to heal. I was too afraid to face it, too afraid to admit that maybe I could find a way forward. Jack nodded, his expression understanding. He had seen the pain in her eyes before, the weight of everything she had gone through. But he had also seen her strength, her ability to keep going despite it all. It's okay to feel that way, Jack said softly. I think everyone runs from their past, in one way or another. But what matters is what you do with it. You don't have to forget it, but you don't have to carry it with you forever either. Scylla looked up at him then, her eyes wide as if she hadn't expected such an answer. There was a vulnerability in her gaze that Jack hadn't seen before, and it made his heart ache for her. You really believe that? She asked, her voice filled with wonder. Jack smiled gently. I do. I believe that we all have the power to decide who we want to be. Our pasts don't have to control us. For a long moment, Scylla sat in silence, absorbing his words. The sun continued to set in the sky, casting a warm, peaceful light over them both. It felt like time had slowed down, like the world had paused to let them have this moment. I think I want to try, Scylla said slowly, her voice full of quiet determination. I want to try to move forward. I want to try to heal. Maybe I can't forget everything, but I don't have to let it define me anymore. I want to be more than my past. Jack's heart swelled with pride. He had watched her struggle, seen her fight against the weight of her memories, and now she was choosing to move forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. You're stronger than you think, Jack said, his voice full of warmth. You've already come so far. I believe in you, Scylla. Scylla smiled, a small but genuine smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who had all the answers, but the smile of someone who was ready to face the future, no matter how uncertain it might be. Thank you, Jack, she said quietly. For everything. For not giving up on me. I didn't think I could trust anyone again. But you've shown me that there's hope. Jack shook his head, his smile soft. It's not me, Scylla. It's you. You're the one who's been strong through all of this. I've just been here, helping you along the way. She looked at him for a long time, as though weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. Maybe you're right. The silence between them felt different now. It wasn't heavy with unspoken fears or doubts. It was a comfortable silence, one that held the promise of new beginnings, of a future that was still to be written. As the night began to fall, Jack and Scylla stood up, stretching after sitting for so long. The stars were beginning to appear in the sky, just as they had so many nights before. Scylla looked up, her gaze fixed on the twinkling lights above. I used to look at the stars and feel lost, she said, her voice soft but steady, like I didn't belong anywhere. But now when I look at them, I feel different, like maybe I'm part of something bigger. Maybe I'm not so alone. Jack followed her gaze, his eyes also turning to the sky. We're all part of something bigger, Scylla. We just have to remember that sometimes. Scylla smiled again, this time with a sense of peace. I'll try to remember. They stood there for a few more minutes, side by side, watching the stars in silence. The world around them was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. No war, no fear, just two people finding their way together. As they walked back inside, Jack looked over at Scylla, his heart light. They had both come so far, and though they didn't know what the future held, they knew they would face it together.